Professor Brightspark adjusted his fourth set of appendages nervously as he glided through the crystalline corridors of the Galactic University's Advanced Sciences wing. His bioluminescent spots flickered in a pattern that any fellow Luminian would recognize as supreme self-satisfaction, though he tried his best to suppress it. After all, it wasn't professional to literally glow with pride, even if you were the youngest tenured professor in the university's 12,000-year history. The morning light of 3 suns streamed through the transparent quantum-reinforced walls, creating rainbow refractions that danced across the stream of students hurrying to their classes. Professor Brightspark paused briefly to admire his reflection in a nearby crystal panel. All 6 of his eye stalks were perfectly groomed, and his ceremonial academic robe shimmered with the appropriate gravitas expected of a level 9 quantum mechanics instructor. Professor Brightspark, a high-pitched voice called out, belonging to one of his teaching assistants, a gaseous entity named Puff, who had to maintain their form within a containment suit. The new class roster has been updated for the semester. Ah, excellent, Brightspark hummed, his vocal sacs vibrating at precisely the right frequency to convey both authority and disinterest. I trust it's the usual collection of the galaxy's finest minds? All thoroughly vetted by the Council of Academic Excellence. Puff's containment suit wobbled anxiously. Well, sir, about that there's been an unusual addition. Brightspark's eye stalks all swiveled toward Puff, simultaneously a gesture that usually made junior faculty members dissolve into their component molecules from stress. Unusual how? The Galactic Council has, well, they've mandated that we accept a student from a newly discovered species. For diversity initiatives, you see. Oh, spare me the bureaucratic nonsense, Brightspark sighed, releasing a small cloud of spores that his species used to express exasperation. Which backwater civilization are we babysitting this time? The photosynthetic philosophers from Chloros IX. The quantum-entangled hive mind from the B Nebula. Humans, sir. From Earth. Brightspark's bioluminescent spots flickered in what could only be described as a spectacular display of disbelief. Earth? That tiny water-logged rock that had only recently figured out how to split the atom without accidentally destroying themselves. The same species that still used combustion engines in some parts of their world? Absolutely not, he declared, all 6 eyes blinking in sequence. My class is legendary across 17 star systems. I've reduced quantum physicists with 300 years of experience to tears. My assignments have caused 2 different species to evolve additional brain lobes just to cope with the computational requirements. The professor's reputation was indeed the stuff of academic legend. His final projects were so notorious that students would often take them twice, once to fail spectacularly, and a second time to fail slightly less spectacularly, but with better understanding of why they failed. The university had actually had to create a special grading curve just for his classes, one that somehow involved imaginary numbers and occasionally produced results in different dimensions. The paperwork has already been processed, Sir Puff wobbled apologetically. They're calling it the Interstellar Academic Exchange Program. Brightspark's color shifted to a deep shade of indigo, the Luminian equivalent of a resigned sigh. Fine, but I won't adjust my standards, not one quantum fluctuation. If they want to swim in the deep end of the galactic intellectual pool, they'll have to learn to breathe vacuum like everyone else. As he continued his way to the lecture hall, Brightspark began mentally revising his infamous week-long quantum mechanics project. Perhaps he'd add a few extra dimensions to the calculations, just to maintain the proper academic rigor. After all, he had a reputation to uphold, and no primitively evolved bipedal species was going to change that. Little did Professor Brightspark know that his carefully maintained reputation was about to be turned on its head. All 6 eyes of IT. Professor Brightspark swept into the lecture hall the next morning, his academic robes billowing dramatically in his personal gravity field. His entrance usually inspired awe and terror in equal measure, but today something was off. The usual terrified silence was broken by whispers and the occasional gasp. Each of his eye stalks swiveled independently, taking in the usual assortment of advanced species. There was a cluster of quantum probability clouds sharing the same space-time coordinates, a few crystalline beings refracting light in complex mathematical patterns, and even a temporal anomaly who was simultaneously arriving late and leaving early. And then he saw it, the human. Marcus Rodriguez sat in the middle row, looking ridiculously solid and unchanging compared to his fellow students. No extra dimensions, no quantum uncertainty about his position, not even a slight temporal displacement. Just flesh and bones, and a rather garish piece of clothing the human database called a Hawaiian shirt. "Welcome to Advanced Quantum Mechanics," Brightspark announced, his vocal sacs deliberately producing frequencies that would induce mild anxiety in most species. "I see we have our usual diverse group of the galaxy's finest minds and—" He paused meaningfully, all 6 eyes focusing on Marcus, our mandatory diversity inclusion. The human had the audacity to smile and wave. Actually wave, with a single appendage, like some kind of primitive signal flag. "Yo, Prof B. Loving the bioluminescence really brings out your eye stalks." Several quantum probability clouds collapsed in shock. A silicon-based student crystallized temporarily. The temporal anomaly student experienced a brief paradox. Brightspark spots flashed in patterns that would have made a Luminian linguist blush. That's Professor Brightspark, and in this class we maintain proper academic decorum. At all times he pulled up the class roster on his quantum display. "I see you scored adequately on the entrance exams, Mr. Rodriguez." "Call me Marcus." "And yeah, those tests were pretty fun. Especially the 11-dimensional calculus part reminded me of this game we used to play in high school." The professor's spots dimmed dangerously. Fun? High school? They let this species into his class based on games they played as juveniles. "Very well, Marcus," he said, making the name sound like a particularly complex quantum equation. "Let's see how fun you find my class. I assume you're all prepared for today's assignment." The human's continued smile was beginning to make Brightspark's auxiliary nervous system twitch. This would not do at all. Not at all. Professor Brightspark activated the quantum projection system, and the air above his podium filled with equations that twisted through several dimensions at once. Several students started recording with their neural interfaces. The temporal anomaly student was already looking up answers from next week, which was technically cheating but impossible to prove. "Your assignment," he announced, his vocal sacs vibrating with unholy glee, "is the infamous quantum reconciliation project. You have precisely 1 standard week to complete it." A collective groan echoed through the lecture hall. 2 of the quantum probability clouds began to blur at the edges, a sure sign of anxiety. The crystalline student had gone completely opaque. "As some of you may have heard," Brightspark continued, his spots pulsing with sadistic pleasure, "this project has quite a reputation. Last semester it caused a hive mind collective to split into individual personalities. The semester before that, a temporal mathematics major had to take a century-long sabbatical just to recover. Marcus Rodriguez was doodling something on an archaic piece of processed tree pulp. Actually doodling, with a primitive carbon-based marking tool. The sheer disrespect made Brightspark's auxiliary digestion system clench. The project requires you to reconcile quantum uncertainties across 13 dimensions while accounting for temporal paradoxes in at least 7 alternate timelines. You must show all your work, including the calculations that prove why the impossible solutions are impossible. A silicon-based student in the front row had already begun to crystallize from stress. Their teaching assistant, Puff, quickly adjusted their containment field to prevent a full-scale molecular breakdown. Additionally, Brightspark added, noting with satisfaction that even the temporal anomaly student had stopped trying to peek at next week's answers, you must account for the Heisenberg compensation factor across all quantum states simultaneously, while maintaining probe coherence in a sub-zero Kelvin environment. He paused for dramatic effect, waiting for the usual wave of panic to sweep through the class. The quantum probability clouds were now occupying 7 different positions simultaneously, none of them calm. The crystalline student had developed a visible crack from the stress. But Marcus was whistling, actually whistling, some primitive earth melody that the professor's universal translator identified as "don't worry, be happy." "Something amusing you?" Mr. Rodriguez Brightspark asked, all 6 eyes narrowing to pinpoints of light. "Nah, Prof B. Just thinking this sounds like a fun puzzle. Kind of like that time I had to figure out how to fit my entire gaming setup into a tiny dorm room. It's all about efficient space utilization, right?" The professor's spots flashed in patterns that would have translated to several prohibited words in polite Luminian society. Did this human not understand? Was his primitive neural network incapable of processing the magnitude of the task? Mr. Rodriguez, perhaps I should mention that last year, this assignment caused a quantum computing specialist to question the nature of reality itself. They're still in therapy, occasionally manifesting as pure mathematics. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, while pulling out what appeared to be a beverage container with the words "World's Okayest Student" printed on it. That's rough, buddy. But you know what they say on Earth, the best way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time. The universal translator struggled with this idiom, causing several nearby quantum displays to glitch. Brightspark felt a headache forming in all three of his brain clusters. You have exactly one standard week, he repeated, enunciating each word with precise frequencies designed to instill dread. I suggest you all begin immediately. Except for those of you existing in multiple temporal states simultaneously, you technically began yesterday. As the class erupted into a flurry of activity, with students rushing to secure quantum computing resources and temporal reference materials, Marcus just stretched in his chair and took another sip from his beverage container. No time like the present, the human said cheerfully, making absolutely no move to start what should have been a panic-inducing project. The next few moments would later be recorded in the Galactic University's archives as the 5 minutes that changed everything. Though Professor Brightspark would personally refer to it as the great humiliation for centuries to come. Marcus Rodriguez set down his World's Okayest Student cup with a decisive thunk. Right then, let's knock this out before lunch. I'm thinking tacos today. A ripple of confusion spread through the lecture hall. The quantum probability clouds condensed slightly in bewilderment. Even the temporal anomaly student stopped trying to exist in multiple time streams simultaneously. Mr. Rodriguez, Professor Brightspark said, his spots pulsing with barely contained irritation. Perhaps your primitive neural pathways failed to process the magnitude of this assignment. This is not some simple calculation. Oh no, I got it, Marcus interrupted, pulling out what appeared to be an ancient computational device. The professor's sensors indicated it was something called a graphing calculator, practically Stone Age technology by galactic standards. 13 dimensions, 7 timelines, quantum uncertainty, sub-zero Kelvin environment. Pretty straightforward stuff. Straightforward, the crystalline student's crack widened noticeably. The preliminary calculations alone should take at least 2 days. Marcus typed something into his calculator, his fingers moving with surprising speed. See, that's where you're overthinking it. The sub-zero Kelvin environment actually makes things easier because you don't have to account for thermal interference. And once you realize that, the 13 dimensions practically sort themselves out. Professor Brightspark's eye stalks all swiveled toward the human in perfect synchronization. What exactly are you suggesting? Well, Marcus said, still typing, if you approach it from a video game speedrunning perspective. A what puff's containment suit wobbled dangerously. Speedrunning. You know, finding the most efficient path through a complex system. Anyway, if you look at it that way, you can see that dimensions 8 through 13 are really just mirrors of the first 5, plus some quantum wiggle room. The professor's spots began flashing in patterns that hadn't been seen since the great mathematical crisis of the Third Epoch. That's completely absurd. The quantum reconciliation algorithms alone are basically just fancy versions of the cheat codes we used to use in games, Marcus continued, now scribbling something on his paper. Look, if you treat each temporal paradox as a game level, you can see they're all running on the same basic rules. It's like trying to clip through walls in Super Mario 64. The temporal anomaly student accidentally phased out of reality for a moment from sheer confusion. When they remanifested, Marcus was already on what appeared to be the final page of calculations. The Heisenberg compensation factor, Professor Brightspark sputtered, his auxiliary nervous system now completely malfunctioning. The quantum state coherence requirements. Oh, those cancel each other out if you approach them simultaneously, Marcus replied cheerfully. It's like trying to pat your head and rub your belly at the same time. Looks complicated until you realize you can do both without thinking about either. A quantum probability cloud partially collapsed from the shock, requiring immediate intervention from Puff. The crystalline student had developed so many stress fractures they were beginning to resemble abstract art. And done, Marcus announced, standing up with a handful of papers. Mind if I turn this in now? Those tacos aren't going to eat themselves. Professor Brightspark's spots had gone completely dark, a sign of either extreme shock or temporary brain death in Luminians. His vocal sacs took 3 attempts to produce sound. You can't possibly have this assignment requires. Marcus walked down to the podium, flipping through his work. I showed all my steps, included the impossible solution proofs, and even added some bonus calculations about how this could optimize Earth's video game loading screens. Oh, and I found a cool shortcut through the 11th dimension that might help with university parking problems. The professor's trembling appendages accepted the papers. His 6 eyes scanned the calculations with increasing speed, each eye stalk twitching independently. The mathematical proofs were flawless. The quantum reconciliations were elegant in their simplicity. The impossible solutions were proven impossible with a level of clarity that made the standard proofs look like nursery rhymes. And in the margins were little doodles of what appeared to be smiling faces, and something called a pizza. This Professor Brightspark's vocal sacs were barely functioning. Professor Puff ventured nervously. Your spots are starting to form fractal patterns. 4 minutes and 23 seconds, the professor finally exploded, his bioluminescence now bright enough to require protective eyewear. You completed a week-long quantum mechanics project in 4 minutes and 23 seconds. Marcus shrugged, already packing up his ancient calculator. Yeah, sorry about being slow. The battery on my calculator is kind of old, and I had to carry the one a couple times manually. The temporal anomaly student tried to verify this claim by checking other timelines, but found that every single one showed the same impossible result. The quantum probability clouds had completely given up on maintaining coherent forms and were now just vaguely distressed shapes in space. But how Professor Brightspark managed to ask, his entire worldview crumbling around him. Like I said, video games, Prof B. When you grow up trying to sequence break Mario games and speedrun Dark Souls, quantum mechanics is basically just a really fancy puzzle game. Marcus glanced at his primitive timepiece. Now, about those tacos. The lecture hall had fallen into a silence so profound that you could hear a quantum fluctuation drop. Professor Brightspark's spots had settled into a confused pattern that looked remarkably like television static. Perhaps, the professor said, his vocal sacs struggling to maintain a professional frequency. You could explain your methodology to the class, Mr. Rodriguez. Marcus, who had been researching local taco restaurants on his primitive communication device, looked up with a grin. Sure thing. It's actually pretty simple when you break it down. He walked to the quantum projection system and, ignoring its complex neural interface, pulled out his marker and began drawing on the board beneath it. The crystalline student nearly shattered at this blatant disregard for advanced technology. See, most of you were probably planning to approach this like a traditional quantum mechanics problem, Marcus explained, sketching what appeared to be a crude diagram. But humans, we're lazy, like professionally lazy. We're always looking for shortcuts. Shortcuts. Professor Brightspark's eye stalks twitched spasmodically. In theoretical quantum mechanics. Exactly. Look at dimension 8 through 13. Marcus drew some more lines that somehow made perfect sense despite their simplicity. They're just dimension 1 through 5 doing a little dance and wearing a fake mustache. Once you spot that, you can solve them all at once. The quantum probability clouds began to coalesce as understanding dawned. One of them actually gasped, causing a minor probability cascade. But the temporal paradox's Puff wobbled uncertainly. That's where gaming comes in handy, Marcus beamed. Ever tried to speedrun Portal? Same principle. You're not trying to solve each timeline separately, you're looking for the glitch that lets you clip through all of them at once. The temporal anomaly student suddenly manifested in 3 different locations, their mind blown across multiple timelines. As for the Heisenberg compensation factor, Marcus continued, now drawing what appeared to be a stick figure doing a cartwheel. That's just uncertainty with extra steps. In gaming, we call that RNG manipulation, random number generator. Speedrunners do this stuff for fun. Professor Brightspark's spots were now cycling through colors not normally visible in this dimension. Are you suggesting that quantum uncertainty is just a game mechanic? Well, when you think about it, isn't everything? Marcus shrugged. The universe is basically running on a really complicated engine. Once you understand the rules, you can optimize your route through them. The crystalline student had begun taking notes so frantically they were starting to melt. The quantum probability clouds were reforming themselves into patterns that suspiciously resembled gaming controllers. But the sub-zero Kelvin environment calculations, the professor protested weakly. "Oh, that's just like putting your gaming console in the freezer to prevent overheating." Marcus paused. "Not that I've ever done that. More than twice. But the principle is the same. When you remove heat from the equation, everything runs smoother." He stepped back from his diagram, which somehow managed to explain quantum mechanics through video game references and stick figures. "The real trick is not overthinking it. You guys are all so smart, you sometimes miss the obvious solutions because you're looking for the complicated ones." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the temporal anomaly student trying to process this information across multiple timelines simultaneously. This is Professor Brightspark struggled to find words in any of the 300 languages he knew. "Pretty cool, right?" Marcus glanced at his watch again. "Now, about those tacos, anyone want to join? I found this place that claims to serve food from all 7 spiral arms of the galaxy, though I'm guessing their Earth-style tacos probably taste nothing like the real thing." No one moved. No one spoke. Even the quantum probability clouds had stopped their usual quantum jittering. "No takers?" "Your loss." Marcus gathered his things, his ancient calculator making a cheerful beeping sound as he pocketed it. "Thanks for the fun puzzle, Prof. B. Let me know if you've got any more video game-style problems to solve." 1 year later, Professor Brightspark stood before the Galactic Academic Conference, his spots glowing with an entirely new pattern that the emotional recognition systems classified as enlightened amusement. "Fellow academics," he began, addressing the diverse crowd of beings from across the galaxy, "we have been getting it wrong for 12,000 years. The audience rustled, flickered, and wobbled in their seats. In the front row, Marcus Rodriguez gave him a thumbs up while playing something called Elden Ring on his handheld device. "We thought complexity was the answer. We believed that the more dimensions we added, the more profound our understanding would become. But then humans arrived and showed us something remarkable: the power of working smarter, not harder." A quantum probability cloud raised an appendage. "But surely they're primitive technology." Primitive. Brightspark's spots flashed with laughter. "My dear colleague, I recently completed Portal 2 in under an hour. Let me tell you about primitive. We were the primitive ones, too busy showing off our quantum calculations to notice the shortcuts built into the universe itself." The crystalline beings in the audience clinked nervously. Several temporal anomaly researchers checked future timelines to verify his claims. "Today I am proud to announce that Galactic University is establishing the first ever Department of Human Efficiency Studies. And yes, the entire curriculum will be structured like a video game, complete with side quests and achievement unlocks." Marcus had progressed to a boss battle, his fingers moving across the controls with the same efficiency he'd applied to quantum mechanics. The hive mind collectives were already taking notes on his strategy. But most importantly, Brightspark continued, all 6 eye stalks gleaming. "We must acknowledge that sometimes the most elegant solution is the one that makes us laugh at ourselves." He paused, his spots forming a pattern that would have been impossible a year ago, genuine humility mixed with joy. "And now I would like to introduce our new Dean of Human Studies, who will oversee this revolutionary program. Marcus, if you could just finish saving your game." Marcus looked up from his device. "Oh, about that, Prof. B. I actually have to decline the position." Brightspark's spots flickered in confusion. "But your contributions to quantum mechanics, your revolutionary teaching methods." "Yeah, it's been fun," Marcus grinned. "But I just got accepted into this really cool program back on Earth. Apparently, some game company wants me to help optimize their physics engine." The audience erupted into chaos. 3 quantum probability clouds fainted. The temporal anomaly researchers accidentally created a new timeline trying to process this information. "You're leaving academia to make games." Professor Brightspark's vocal sacs nearly short-circuited. "Think about it," Marcus said, standing up. "We're better to develop new quantum mechanics theories than in a game engine. Besides, I figured out this really cool way to use quantum tunneling to reduce loading times. Could revolutionize open-world games." Brightspark spots displayed a pattern that the universal translator simply gave up on attempting to describe. "But before I go," Marcus added with a grin, "I should probably tell you about this thing we humans call speedrunning tutorials on YouTube. Trust me, Prof. B, your mind is about to be blown all over again. And so, as Marcus Rodriguez left to revolutionize the gaming industry with quantum mechanics, Professor Brightspark found himself subscribing to something called Twitch. After all, he reasoned as his spots glowed with anticipation, you never knew where the next breakthrough in theoretical physics might come from. Though he did make a mental note to keep the university's gaming consoles away from the temporal anomaly students, the last thing the universe needed was someone trying to speedrun time itself. Or maybe, he thought as his spots flickered mischievously, that was exactly what the universe had been waiting for.